There was a moment at Brown's training camp today that stopped everybody watching dead in their tracks. Shadeur Sanders drops back, reads the defense like he's been doing it for years, goes through his progression cleanly, and delivers a ball that is placed perfectly, exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to get there, a touchdown waiting to happen. And Jeudy just doesn't catch it. The ball hits the ground. Clean drop. No defender draped across him forcing an impossible adjustment, no contested angle making the catch genuinely difficult. Both hands available, ball right there, and it still ends up in the dirt instead of the end zone. That's the moment everybody's been talking about since practice wrap today. But here's the thing. That single drop isn't even the whole story, not even close, because when you zoom out and look at what's actually been happening across this entire stretch of camp, a much bigger and far more uncomfortable picture starts coming into focus. And that's exactly what we're going to get into today. But before we go any further, there's something worth saying clearly right at the top. Calling a player out for drops is fair. Calling a player out for a documented pattern of drops showing up repeatedly across multiple practices is also fair. Calling it sabotage without a single piece of real evidence to back that up, that's a different conversation entirely, and it's not one worth having here. What we're going to do instead is look at what's actually on the field, talk honestly about what it means, and give you the full picture of everything that went down at day 13 of Brown's training camp, because there was genuinely a lot worth unpacking today beyond just one frustrating play. Let's start with that drop specifically, because it deserves a proper breakdown rather than just a quick mention and a move on. When you actually watch the mechanics of what happened on that play, the first thing that stands out is how clean the pocket was behind Sanders on the throw. He wasn't under pressure. He wasn't getting rushed into a hurried release that might have knocked the timing slightly off or forced an awkward delivery angle. He had time. He used it well. He went through his reads and he put the ball where it needed to be. The placement was accurate. The timing was on point. There is genuinely nothing to blame on the throw itself when you look at it honestly. The issue was sitting entirely on the other end of that connection. Jeudy had both hands available to make the catch. The ball arrived in stride. No contact forced an adjustment at the catch point, and it simply didn't stick. That's what makes this particular type of drop more mentally frustrating for everybody involved than a genuinely contested, difficult one would be. When the ball is clean, the hands are free, and the catch still doesn't happen, there's no external excuse to grab onto. It just sits there as a drop, plain and simple. And the reason that matters beyond just this one play is that by multiple accounts from people who were actually at practice watching this unfold in real time, this was at minimum the second or third time across this specific stretch of camp that a catchable ball intended for Jeudy has hit the ground instead of getting secured. That's not a one-off fluke anymore. That's a pattern. And patterns are worth talking about honestly, especially when they're happening to a receiver throwing with a quarterback who's been delivering the football accurately enough that the drops are the main story rather than the throws themselves. Sanders deserved a highlight on that rep. What he got instead was another line in the stat sheet that undersells just how well he actually threw the football on that particular play. Now here's where it's worth slowing down and making a real distinction, because not all drops are created equal, and understanding the difference matters quite a bit for how seriously we should be reading this situation. There are drops that happen because of genuine physical difficulty at the catch point. The ball is thrown behind the receiver, forcing an off-balance adjustment. A defender gets a hand in at the last second. The receiver is running a route that puts him in an inherently awkward body position when the ball arrives. Those drops are frustrating, but they have real explanations attached to them. Then there are concentration drops. The ball is accurate, the receiver has clean positioning, both hands are available, and the catch still doesn't happen because something in the mental process between seeing the ball arrive and securing it through contact breaks down at the critical moment. That second category is what we're dealing with here with Jeudy, and the reason it tends to create more alarm than the first type is that concentration drops are harder to pin on external factors. You can adjust a route, you can scheme around a coverage problem. Fixing a mental lapse in the catch process is a different kind of work entirely. None of that means Jeudy is a broken player or that his career is suddenly falling apart at the seams. His talent is not the question here. Nobody in that building, and nobody around this league more broadly, is seriously questioning whether Jeudy has genuine ability as a receiver. He's shown real route-running polish across multiple practices this camp. He's flashed the kind of separation skill that made him a first-round pick coming out of college. That part of his game isn't suddenly gone. But talent and separation ability don't ultimately matter if the football isn't landing in his hands consistently when it counts. And this kind of recurring drop stretch, however isolated it may ultimately turn out to be once more practices give us a fuller sample, is exactly the type of thing that puts real, tangible pressure on a receiver heading into an actual preseason game against a defense that isn't going to extend the same benefit of the doubt that a low-stakes training camp rep sometimes does. Let's get to the full quarterback tracker from today, because Sanders and Watson both had full days worth breaking down properly beyond just the Jeudy play. Sanders finished 13 of 21 passing with 1 touchdown. Watson went 12 of 17 with 0 touchdowns and 0 turnovers, which is a clean, controlled day in terms of not creating negative plays, even if the scoring output wasn't exactly eye-catching. Dylan Grable was 4 of 5 in limited work, and Talon Green continues to see no first-team reps at this stage of camp, which remains a quiet storyline in its own right, even if it's getting drowned out by all the noise surrounding the top 2 names in this quarterback room. On Watson specifically, 12 of 17 works out to roughly a 70% completion rate, and taken on its own, that's a genuinely solid efficiency number, regardless of who's throwing it on a given day. The overall volume was lower than some of his earlier practices this camp, which makes sweeping conclusions a little harder to draw from a smaller sample. But efficiency at that rate, even within a lighter workload, is worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over. And if Watson is genuinely trending toward more controlled decision-making in the pocket, fewer forced throws into tight windows, and cleaner reads before releasing the football, that's exactly the kind of steady, incremental progress this coaching staff has been publicly asking him to demonstrate throughout this entire camp. It would be inconsistent to only ever highlight his rougher days, without also giving real credit when the cleaner, more controlled ones show up on the field. Sanders, meanwhile, didn't have a perfect day from start to finish. Gross's overall read on the practice was that it started out fairly flat and not especially competitive for long stretches, before Sanders specifically lit the day up right at the very end of it. And the way he closed it out is genuinely worth describing in some detail, because it illustrates something real about how he operates under pressure in a simulated game-deciding situation. On the final 2-minute drill of the day, Sanders led a drive starting from his own 21-yard line with under a minute on the clock. The practice had been running low on energy for much of the afternoon by that point. The competitive juice around him wasn't at its peak, and then he lofted a ball on 3rd down that by all accounts looked genuinely uncertain in the air as it traveled, visibly wobbling the entire way to its target before Isaiah Bond laid out completely and made a full extension diving catch to bring it in cleanly and set up the go-ahead field goal. The throw ended up landing right on the mark despite how shaky it looked in flight, and Bond absolutely deserves real credit for making a great individual play to finish that connection off properly. But the larger point worth sitting with here is the situation surrounding it. Sanders delivered a clutch throw on a low-energy practice day in a simulated pressure moment at the exact time the day needed something to make it memorable. That's a different skill than producing highlights when the entire practice is already buzzing with energy and the competitive atmosphere is doing half the work for you. Rising to a moment on a flat day is a specific mental attribute worth giving separate credit for. And by the closing description of that practice from people who were there watching it unfold, Sanders sent everybody home with something worth talking about on a day that hadn't been offering much of that through most of its earlier hours. The 2-minute drill results also deserve a small piece of honest context, though, because it's relevant to how fairly we should be reading those outcomes for both quarterbacks. Both Sanders and Watson led drives that ended in field goals during that closing period, and this Browns defense, post-Myles Garrett trade, isn't quite the same unit it was a season ago when Garrett was capable of single-handedly taking away one entire side of the field and making life genuinely miserable for opposing quarterbacks. Losing that kind of presence changes how legitimately difficult these 2-minute practice reps actually are for either quarterback working against this particular defensive group. That doesn't erase what Sanders did or what Watson did, but it does add a layer of honest context worth carrying when we talk about what those drives actually proved. Eisen weighed in on this quarterback competition recently, and it's worth including here specifically because it's a national voice with no obvious rooting interest in Cleveland, making essentially the same basic point that a lot of Browns fans have already been making themselves for weeks. Eisen said plainly on his own show that Todd Monken cannot realistically look his own locker room in the eye and tell the players in that room that a different quarterback is starting if those players genuinely believe Sanders has outplayed and outcompeted Watson across the bulk of this camp. His point, stated directly, was that the team collectively sees Sanders as their guy, as the natural leader of that offense. That internal reality eventually has to get reflected in the actual decision, regardless of what Watson is still owed on his existing contract. He drew a direct comparison to Russell Wilson's situation in Denver, pointing out that plenty of teams around this league have paid veteran quarterbacks significant guaranteed money and still moved on from them entirely when the on-field performance simply didn't hold up against what that contract implied about their level. That's not some hot take manufactured purely to generate clicks or attention. That's a national NFL voice with a wide platform saying what the film and the practice reports have been pointing toward for some time now. And the part of it that carries the most real weight isn't the contract angle or the comparison to Wilson, it's the locker room point. Players know who's been showing up rep after rep. They know who's been delivering in the moments that matter. They know who's been earning trust steadily across 13 practices of real work. Whatever Monken says publicly at a podium, what the room itself believes about who their quarterback is matters in a way that can't just be overridden by a roster decision that contradicts everything they've seen with their own eyes. Let's talk about the full receiver room picture today, because this practice was more than just the Jeudy situation, and it wouldn't be fair to let one frustrating drop completely define how the entire receiving group looked. There was a genuinely strong connection between Sanders and Isaiah Bond continuing to build today, and that diving catch at the end of the 2-minute drill was the kind of play that becomes part of a narrative when it shows up at the right moment. Casey Cousins continues to look like a real, consistent presence in the passing game. Not a flash-in-the-pan connection that shows up once and disappears, but something that's been building steadily across these practices, rep by rep, settling comfortably into zone coverage windows and picking up real chunk yardage after the catch. Boston has been winning contested targets consistently against top-tier cornerback competition throughout this camp. Fannin is still working his way back toward full health and full involvement, but he remains part of a receiver room that has more legitimate depth than it's getting credit for in most of the national coverage surrounding this team. And even Jeudy, rough recent stretch notwithstanding, is still a receiver fully capable of winning clean separation from press coverage. His route running technique isn't the concern here. The concern is purely and specifically about finishing the catch once the separation has already been earned. That's an important distinction because it means the problem, frustrating as it currently is narrower than it might look from the outside. It's not that his game has broken down across the board, it's that one specific piece of the full process, securing the football through the moment of catch, has been letting him down at the worst possible times. What that looks like once real preseason snaps start arriving is the question that actually matters heading forward. There was also a nice throw from Watson to Bond worth acknowledging here, because credit belongs where it's earned, and Watson made a clean, well-timed delivery on that connection. Giving him that is part of covering this competition fairly, rather than selectively building a one-sided case in either direction. Now to the actual news of the day, because there were real substantive updates from the ground at camp that are worth walking through clearly.
Monken did not reveal his starting quarterback decision for the Chicago game before today's practice, confirming that he already privately knows who's starting, but plans to tell both quarterbacks directly tonight in a private team meeting, rather than making the announcement public just yet. He laid out the full structural plan for both upcoming preseason games, and it's worth repeating clearly one more time because it's the single most important piece of practical information heading into this weekend. Whoever starts plays at least the first half against Chicago. The other quarterback comes in fresh for the third quarter, and the entire order flips completely the following week when Buffalo comes to Cleveland for joint practices and another preseason game. That structure gives each quarterback a genuine extended opportunity to make a statement in a live setting against real opposing personnel, and it's deliberately designed to generate as much useful evaluation data as this coaching staff can extract from 2 preseason games before the regular season forces a final decision. On the injury front, several players are unlikely to suit up in Chicago given where they currently stand physically. Linebacker Carson Schwezinger is in that group. Cornerback Tyson Campbell missed yet another practice today. Starting center Ethan Pocic wasn't on the field at all, and backup center Parker Brown is also in that same uncertain category heading into the weekend. Those are all names worth monitoring as the roster picture continues to take shape. Today was also officially the final day of open practice for this stretch of camp, which means no more fans in attendance at upcoming sessions going forward. Next week brings a significantly bigger challenge when the Buffalo Bills come to Cleveland specifically for joint practices, the first real extended look either quarterback gets against a genuinely different team's actual defensive scheme, unfamiliar coverages, and personnel they haven't been studying and practicing against every single day for weeks. That's a different kind of test entirely than what either Sanders or Watson has faced across these 13 practices, and it's coming fast.
The travel logistics for this Chicago trip are worth mentioning briefly because they say something real about how seriously this coaching staff is treating what's technically just a preseason opener. The team heads to Chicago tomorrow for a full road trip experience. Team dinner, a simulated away game walkthrough at a local high school, and standard Friday night meetings before Saturday's kickoff. The entire week has been deliberately built to mirror what an actual regular season road trip looks and feels like structurally. That's not accidental. A first-year head coach building that level of detail and structure into a preseason trip tells you he wants this evaluation to happen in conditions as close to a real NFL environment as possible, rather than treating it as a glorified scrimmage to get through before the games that actually matter in the standings. And that context makes what Saturday needs to answer for each quarterback significantly more interesting than it would be if this were just a low-stakes exhibition. For Sanders, the question is whether everything that has defined his camp, the anticipation throws, the situational discipline, the chemistry he's built with this receiver room, the ability to deliver in the exact moment a drive needs it most, holds up once the defense across from him is running a coordinator's real game plan with disguised coverage looks he hasn't been seeing from his own teammates every day. Recognizing your own team's tendencies and exploiting them efficiently is one thing. Processing a genuinely unfamiliar scheme under real game pressure is a different problem entirely. For Watson, the question is whether the cleaner, more controlled stretches like today's practice can extend into a live setting with real unscripted physicality, real pass rush pressure that isn't holding back the way practice reps sometimes do, and real consequences attached to every decision he makes. Both of those are completely fair, separate, legitimate tests, and neither one gets fully answered until the ball is actually kicked off Saturday afternoon. Let's close with one more honest look at the Jeudy situation, because ending this purely on a negative note without giving him a fair path forward wouldn't be the complete picture. Drops happen to every receiver in this league at some point in their career, including plenty of established number one options with long and genuinely successful track records behind them. The real difference between a rough stretch and a lasting problem almost always comes down to what happens immediately after it. Does the concentration sharpen back up once the pressure of real game action forces full focus?
Does the next contested catch get finished cleanly when it actually counts? Does he respond to a tough few practices with a strong showing once live preseason snaps start arriving and the stakes feel real in a way that training camp reps sometimes don't fully replicate? Those are the questions worth judging him on, and fairly so, once we actually see how they play out rather than assuming the worst permanently based on a rough practice stretch, even a genuinely frustrating one like today's. The receiver room as a whole is deeper than it's getting credit for. The quarterback competition is tighter and more compelling than most national coverage has bothered to properly engage with, and the team heading into Chicago tomorrow is carrying real, unresolved questions that Saturday's game is going to start answering, whether the coaching staff is fully ready for those answers or not. Sanders closes a slow practice day with exactly the kind of moment that's become his signature throughout this camp. Watson turns in a clean, controlled outing worth real credit. Jeudy's drop leaves a mark on the day that won't be forgotten easily, and the whole story now shifts to Chicago, where real live football is finally going to start giving us answers that no amount of practice analysis or training camp reporting can fully provide on its own. The quarterback competition is real, the receiver room questions are real, and the clock is running. Saturday is coming fast, and this one's worth watching closely.